Thanks,
We're
Evan.
here. How's it going, party people? It's good to have you.
Solid.
Oh man, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Most definitely. This is going to be a great one, everybody. So for those who don't know, like these three folks are people I deeply respect. So Cody is someone I've known, I want to say for like a couple years now, man. Like it's kind of just flown by. And it's been so cool to see the exponential growth for Cody, both professionally and personally in the last couple years. He's someone like I respect, like I'd mentioned, and he's the CMO of Jones Road Beauty, a clean beauty brand created by renowned makeup artist Bobby Brown. Jones Road, just to like make sure everyone knows that Cody knows his stuff, has grown their audience by 250%, and they've tripled revenues in 2022. So making that come to life. On Rose's end, Rose is one of the best growth leaders out there, period. We put it down there with a big period. She's spent over a decade in the industry on both the brand and agency side, and currently heads up growth at Very Great. They're the parent company to 3 specific brands. And then Darlene is the chief revenue officer at Tube Science. We've heard Paige from True Classic talk about Tube Science a little bit earlier. So Tube Science is the world's leading pay-for-performance creative company for Meta's largest advertisers. Darlene, I don't know if you remember, but we talked like 4 years ago or something like that. And you were someone I was like immediately impressed by. So I'm so happy that you're joining us today.
It's an honor to be here and share the stage with these two as well.
Amazing. Okay, everybody. So for today, when we're thinking about a data-backed creative pipeline, of course, we want to talk about just like how we start to data back it. But the very first thing that I'm curious about to level set on is, and I'm going to throw it to Cody first, but Cody, on your end, do you believe it to be important to have a data-driven creative pipeline, or is it okay to kind of like shoot from the hip here and there?
Yeah, 100%. One of the most important things, I think, first of all, I really appreciate the kind words. And I think one of the reasons I've been a Motion, customer and fan from the beginning is because you guys have always been trying to blend that mix of performance and creative. And I think it's obviously post iOS something, we've all seen more and more. So yeah, absolutely. I think it's super important. We have gone as far as actually building out what we call a growth creative team. It seems like it's becoming much more common, like a creative pod on the growth team and something like that, because you've got your typical creative team and they can produce amazing work, but they don't always necessarily are focused on performance. So yeah, I think so. And you just need somebody on your team who is making specifically ads specifically for performance, and obviously using data throughout that entire process of concepting and iterations and testing. So yeah, absolutely.
Love it. Love to hear it. And I think the other piece of it, I want to throw this to Darlene now, is get your perspective, because not only have you been at Tube Science for the past little bit, but you're on the meta side. You've been a bunch of different places at the end of the day, right? So you've seen a little bit of all different types of businesses and how they're structured. So curious to get your thoughts on like the importance, if you believe it is, to have a data-driven creative pipeline.
Those are the people that are the companies that tend to do well or break through, right? So I would say that, and yeah, I was at Meta, and I was lucky enough to be one of the first client partners on the e-commerce team, and then one of the first on the disruptors team, which are the two I would say like most focused on data-driven decision making, and got to support some really amazing clients along the way. And then of course at Tube Science, it's exclusively working with those types of partners. And so I'd say data-driven decision making is our lifeblood and the lifeblood of our clients. We stand behind it, and I would say even when shooting from the hip, to use your expression, Evan, you can always, we're lucky enough to live in an era in performance marketing where there's always some access to some research and development and some data that you can gather around while making your decisions. And so basing those hypotheses on those data-driven that data-driven research is ultimately what drives up success rates.
I'm so happy you said that, because like even shooting from the hip, the data points we can get are on general concepts, the personas we're going after, the pain points that we're solving. And Rose, I'm going to throw this one to you, switching it up a little bit from like what is, or do you believe in a data-driven creative pipeline? Because it seems the story is pretty true. If you have any other thoughts, of course, throw them in there. But I'm curious, in your world, like you oversee 3 separate brands ultimately that have different strategies where they start to go to market. So I'm curious about, in your world, when we're thinking about like the data-driven creative strategy side, like who is the primary person that's responsible for that work and making it come to life?
Yeah, I think this ties really nicely to asking about a data-driven creative pipeline, right? Because you're talking about adding data to the pieces that you're doing. But also I think like kind of like when you're talking about shooting from the hip, you're talking about like not being too precious with what you're putting out there. And I think particularly we have 3 different brands. We're also omni-channel. We sell in wholesale, we sell in Amazon, and we sell in D2C. So I guess you could multiply that and make it 9. Nine different ways we're executing, 3 different brands, 3 different channels each. And particularly when it comes to e-commerce and D2C is like what we've learned is we need to balance putting data behind what works and what doesn't work. But also we don't want to optimize ourselves into a hole with that. We don't want to say, well, this works, let's keep doing it, because you do that without adding kind of that, not necessarily shooting from the hip, right? You're not just going out there and making up something you don't think is going to work at all, right? You're taking a couple of pieces and bringing it into it. And we try to marry kind of like this iterative and variation type mindset with let's go and create something that's new that ties to a new brand pillar or a new product launch, something that maybe we're taking inspiration from a competitor or something that we've seen other people do, and kind of like throwing something out there. It's maybe I don't know if I'd say 50-50 balance. We lean a little more on the data side than we do the shooting from the hip side. But I think both are actually very equally important, or you can end up optimizing yourself into a hole.
For sure. And what I'm curious about before we get like deep into budgeting, like now we're just talking about the jobs to be done at the end of the day. And I think we need to hashtag shooting from the hip because it sounds like we're rocking with it for a little bit. So Darlene, I'm actually going to throw this one back to you. So when it comes to the data points, like you had mentioned, when you're coming up basically with new concepts, we might not have as much data like to iterate and create a bunch of different things, but where is your team ultimately looking to get those data points to then inform what they start to make?
That's such a solid question, Evan. So the first thing that we do when we take on any new partner is we do this full stack research and development project where we're trying to look at their total addressable market and group them into different personas. And then those personas ultimately translate into different types of concepts that we can keep delivering to the client that ultimately result in diversity of delivery on social platforms. And ultimately, it's the best thing for the liquidity of your account at 7-figure plus levels of spend. And you're trying to spend profitably, of course. So the sources that we look at, they're pretty much limitless. Like if you're a tube scientist, you have access to everything. You have Pathmatics, you have data AI, you're using chat GBT, you're looking at YouTube comments, you're trying to group everyone's Facebook comments into like type groups and identify different personas. I'll tell you what we don't do. We do not subscribe to like the antiquated methodology of saying, this is Jane and she's 37 years old and she has 2.3 kids and she lives in suburbia and makes, $90,000 a year household income. That's not how we approach this. But to answer your question, I would say that like we take all the limitations off of our teams to be able to look across data sources. Our teams, use Motion. They use tools like all, yeah, we're fans. To try and group those folks together. And then once those personas are developed, it's actually like the next phase becomes writing scripts that are very specific to the visual devices and communication techniques that resonate with those folks.
That's so interesting. One quick follow-up for you is like escaping the piece of we build a persona, this specific person. So what I am curious about is people look for that simplification and you keep it just like problem solution focused, it sounds like. So I'm just curious about where this information goes to live essentially, because you collect it all. Is it a like spreadsheet and that's where you're doing your work, or where is that happening?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll tell you, it wasn't always so easy to organize the data, but we hired a very talented chief data officer, and we took the approach, which was really fruitful for us, where we said, let's find someone that has dealt with a much worse data problem. And so the chief data officer's background at Tube Science is used to work at like some of the largest insurance conglomerates in the world. And that's the most fragmented pipeline. I'm not sure if there's anyone here that's ever worked for an insurance company, but it's like Evan, so maybe you can back me up here. And so we said that let's bring someone in that has figured it out for an issue that's really complex, because video is complex, right? And then of course, what we do is we tag every single experiment that we design to validate or invalidate the hypotheses that we have for identifying those personas that I mentioned in that R&D phase, and then seeing if the visual devices or communication techniques that we're using work. So we have a unique tag that just goes into the ad name, And then the results of those experiments are passed back into our data lake, and then organized into a BI tool, so that we can consolidate that data. So we actually went and made a way
There
to
you
do
go.
this. Yeah. And so we use, like, classic data pipeline tools, Snowflake to organize the data, Power BI Dash, but that's neither here nor there. Like, you can use anything. I've seen clients using Tableau or Looker in various ways. I think the key is actually, like, being able to find someone that can really focus on it, and then building a team around them. Because, as you very well know, Evan, I think Motion shares this with us, that framework is always changing, right? It's changing every time the ecosystem changes, and every time the demand for different kinds of visual devices is going to change. And that's users in control of that. And so then your experiments have to change, and the way you
100%.
consolidate them has to change. So I think that, like, the best advice I can give for any company out there that is trying to emulate that is to make sure that your system is not brittle, and make sure that your team is nimble and able to pivot quickly.
I'm so happy you shared all of this, because really what I wanted to get an insight into is, like, tube science is, from what we've heard, cream of the crop in terms of what you're offering and what the systems start to look like. And all of this conversation is so important when we are talking about budgeting, because at the end of the day, like, what we're talking about is a lot of steps and a lot of work that's happening. So Cody, want to loop you back in. Jones Road, crushing it, been growing like madness. So it's been a great time over there, and great has to be defined. So what I'm curious about is, in your world, what are the things that you take into consideration when you're budgeting on the creative side, on the growth side? So almost, I'd say, like, line items is how I think about it. Oh, Cody, I might have you on mute. I have to unmute you. I might have lost them. Okay. Rose, it's a similar question. In all honesty, I was going to pass it to you after. But just from, like, a resourcing perspective and thinking about the different items that you're budgeting for, what does that look like in your
No,
world? It's the same for 3 brands.
Oh, I think
Oh,
we're getting a little feedback from Corey,
yeah.
from Cody. Yeah, I mean, on our side, it's we think about budgeting for it in terms of, like, where and how do we get creative, right? Like, is this creative we're making ourselves? Is this creative that we're outsourcing to somebody? Is this coming through a partnership or an influencer? And so thinking about the different buckets that falls in. They definitely, I was just on a call this morning with our team reviewing kind of like how much those budgets intermingle and often get shifted around from place to place. I think because we are an omni-channel business that has to support multiple avenues where our creative needs to go, there's always kind of like your photo shoot budget of, like, your kind of like classic brand creative, right? Like our in studio, our styled shots, our like propped shots, things like that we know we have to have those. We know we need them for our website. We know we might use them in ads, but we also need them for some of our external partners or our Amazon, stuff like that. Then there's also the creative pieces. Sometimes some of that goes into ads. Sometimes it doesn't. It really kind of depends on, one, what's performing for us right now. You'd be surprised when those things do work well, right? But generally, more often than not, when we're thinking about more like where we're investing from a paid perspective and the creative we need there, is we're looking more to, like, our UGC partners, our content creators, influencers that we have good relationships with. We have one influencer for one of our brands who has made the majority of our top performing creative in the last year. It's pretty much all been coming from this one partner, and she continues to deliver over and over and over again. We're always like, man, we got to, like, whitelisting rights are coming up again. We got to go and extend those. We got to go and extend ad usage, which is great. Like, and all of her creatives continue to hit that way. So we think about, like, where do we want to continue to build partnerships with people, and especially with, UGC and influencer and creators. And we're looking at that. We're actually currently in process working on trying to build our own network of people we can continually tap into. And especially because we have multiple brands, like, do we have people who can make content for both of the brands? Do we have people who we want to say, hey, you're a good fit not only for this product that we're launching in a couple of months, but also for this campaign we're doing 2 months after that, and this product we're launching 3 months after that, and trying to, like, really think ahead of, like, how can we get them to be an ongoing partner for us, especially once we get proof of data behind it. So there's different buckets those dollars go into, and kind of a little bit of a different way we think about it. But we're also not so much of, like, this budget's only for influencer, and if it doesn't get used there, it can't get used anywhere else. we're often going, well, this budget was for influencer, but we actually have these three really great content creators who maybe don't have the big social following, but we know they're going to make content that's going to kill it in ads. Let's go and get some spend behind them.
And quick follow-up I have for you, because that's super insightful into the process. It's now specifically on the creative resourcing side. You spoke about the external, so creators, influencers, and the internal team. And sometimes this creative doesn't actually live in an ad at the end of the day. So
Yeah.
something that I'm curious about is budgets are typically attached to your goals of where you want to get to. So in your world at this point, there's no perfect answer. We're figuring this out as we go. But in your world, do you go through the exercise of looking to like quantify the creative impact? So it's like we do have that budget for some resourcing internally. Like the reason we spend it here is because we know if we do this thing, it's going to make us some money. Does a process like that happen at all in your world? No pressure if not.
A little bit, not a whole lot, because we also know that there's a larger halo impact from investing in brand and in strong creative that is much less measurable. So we bring the obviously like your paid is tied to revenue, right? Like what you end up spending on ads and all of that. So when we think about where those budgets do get tied back to an ROI, is like if we are like getting whitelisting rights from a creator, right? We're obviously not trying to invest too much up front if we don't know if they're proven. But once they are, thinking about, okay, what's the return on this for both us and them in terms of like the outputs that they're giving us. So that will get tied a little bit more closely to an ROI, but we try to really look at it as being separate, because you can kind of like underinvest yourself there if you try to tie it back to an ROI, because it's so hard to say, like algorithms change every day too. We might invest in something that does really well for a month and then it doesn't perform too well after that, right? And we need to shift gears. So it'd be a little hard to do it that way.
For sure, for sure. But I think like nothing is binary, nothing 0 or 1, just as is. There's always a sliding scale. So I think you touched upon that beautifully, ultimately. Cody, welcome back to the party. We got you back, man.
I'm back.
Ready?
Sorry about that. I had a Wi-Fi issue.
It's all good. That happened to me earlier and I stressed out. So I'm feeling good now. Okay, Cody, I'm not sure if you caught the question, but CMO, Jones Road Beauty, absolutely crushing it 2022, moving into 2023 here. So what I was curious about, similar question that I had asked Rose, is when you are budgeting for that data-backed creative pipeline that you have, what are the different line items that you're typically budgeting for that people in the audience need to think about, essentially?
All right, awesome. Rose's answer was great. So I'll try to piggyback off that a little bit, but definitely agreed. It's not like a piece of content can only live in one account and it can only live in, a paid social creative account or an influencer account. We have a ton of overlap. We do a lot of shooting internally. So, some of that it's specifically for paid. And so we'll have like a sub account under digital ads. And I think the way I think about it is like we have like a total account that's of like all of our kind of paid media plus creative costs. And really what you're trying to do is trying to get that, as efficient as possible. I don't really care if it's 10% on creative and 90% on ads or 80-20, as long as overall it's as efficient as possible. But we've got kind of that, that account there as well. We've also got just like a general photo and shoot account that like our, more of our like brand creative shoots go in. But there's a lot of overlap. We use a lot of that stuff for B-roll, for campaign shoots that we'll kind of use for B-roll. A lot of the stuff that we'll do for like organic content lives there. So it's kind of hard because you will have things that live in multiple places. And same thing as Rose mentioned on kind of like the UGC influencer side. So we will try to, do things. And I think the key is, being as efficient with it as you can. We want to be obviously getting tons of net new concepts in, but we also want to be able to, just continue to build that asset library so that our creative strategists and growth teams can, mash things up and use B-roll and whatnot as we go. So it's just trying to be as efficient as possible. On the influencer side, we might work with somebody on earned media and then tack on a whitelisting fee, and that gets the overall cost down. And we might actually use that same content on organic social if it's relevant to kind of, each medium. But hopefully that's just more efficient and gets the overall cost down rather than getting like 3 separate unique pieces of content behind them.
I love it. And Cody, a follow-up that I have for you is like, specifically speaking, you've gone through a ton of growth at Jones Road Beauty in terms of not only the scale, but like the role and responsibilities that you start to hold. So what I'm curious about is like, this is a great answer now. Compared to last year, was it the same answer? Have you gone through a huge learning phase that you can almost share with the audience of those major learnings in terms of resourcing or anything along those lines?
Yeah, that's a great question. Absolutely. You don't want to be in a position where you're under-resourced on the creative side, and that was certainly a position that we got ourselves in. I think we thought we were fine. What I found is that it takes probably 3 to 6 months of lag, in terms of performance to really kind of hit. And so that's kind of something that was a really good learning lesson. But yeah, just kind of being under resourced. And I think Darlene mentioned earlier, we're in the Disruptors program now, and creative diversity is the key, especially as, ASC is more popular and, AI is kind of taking over more and more. So we kind of found, even as Rose mentioned earlier, like using data, we kind of found like what worked. And that was great from like a 0 to 1 phase. You really only need, one channel, one strategy, one real audience or persona that you're going after. However, if you continue to just try to scale and increase spend to that same audience, to that same avatar with the same type of creative, you're not really going to be reaching additional people. And so what we found, and this is still very much a work in progress, is we really have to think about persona-based targeting. Who are we trying to reach? What are the different messages to reach them? And then also, what are the different creative concepts? Because some people might resonate with the static, some people might resonate with video, some people might resonate with studio versus UGC. And I think there are so many discussions of ugly ads versus pretty ads, static versus video. And the answer is yes. It's just at what stage in the game and how much resource are you giving to each of them. But I think as you get past that 0 to 1 stage, and whether you're going from 7 figures to 8 or going from 8 figures to 9, creative diversity just becomes the name of the game. And trying to figure out, it's a challenge, because you're no longer, what I find is like in-house teams are great at producing one type of concept. It might be beautiful brand stuff. It might be studio productions, and you want to work, then you want creator-based content. You've got to work with your influencer team on that. Then there are agencies that do kind of, more of the native raw content. So I think a mix of kind of in-house and agencies is key, but really it's creative diversity is the name of the game. And you definitely don't want to get in a position where you're really only have kind of one type of thing working for you, which was our biggest mistake and learning lesson.
Love it. Love it. People can walk away with that immediately. And honestly, that gives me an alley-oop that I can kind of just catch and dunk now. So Rose, I'm going to throw it to you first, and then Darlene, I'm going to have you follow up after. But it's really piggybacking off of that last piece that Cody had mentioned. So resourcing, internal, external, mix, all of that good stuff. So Rose, in your world, how do you think about it? Like, how do you determine where you might need some external partners versus something we hire internally? Just your whole process, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
Yeah. We're internal / a mix of freelancers or kind of resources that we lean on right now. We've worked with external partners in the past. I think the challenge with external partners, especially as creative has become more and more important, is I think it can work if you have the right people on your side and the right partner in place, and you're at a budget level where you can take some risks and it's not necessarily going to be the most impactful thing. I think where it's really challenging is when you're in what Cody said, kind of that like phase 1 of like, you have to just kind of figure out what works for you, right? Like working with an external partner can be really hard because they might not know your brand the same way. You might not even know your brand, right? You're still kind of figuring those things out. And I think it can also kind of like limit in terms of the outputs and stuff you get depending on who's working with them, who's managing that flow of information. So right now we're internal. We have a creative director. We have a mix of team that works on our creative side, from production to shooting to, managing the like post-production of it and all of that. We are debating a lot right now, kind of like live as we're thinking about 2024 of like, do we start, have we gotten to a scale of where it makes sense to in-house any of those freelance pieces? And I think, when we think about like one person owning stuff versus the network is, one, it can help to get different perspectives when you have a few external resources that you're working with who are freelancers or different partners that you worked with ongoing. So the extra perspectives can help. Also, we're in a little bit more of a unique position where we have multiple brands and they might have the same deadline, right? Like everybody needs stuff for Black Friday. If we have one person doing it, how do you decide whose gets done first and make sure it gets done in a timeline? So we usually have a couple of different people who are working on some of the exact same things for those types of timelines. But I do think it's generally beneficial, with the kind of direction that creative performance has headed, to have someone internally who is driving the strategy, even if some of your external creation happens through freelancers or an agency or some other partner.
I'm very curious to hear, Darlene, your experience, but Rose, one quick follow-up. In your world, someone who is helping with that strategy, who does that fall to currently from a role perspective on your side?
Right now, it's our creative director. We're actually hiring for a creative strategist role right now, creative and social strategy role. But our creative director has driven a lot of that. He actually started with us as, our photographer, and has scaled up into a much more widespread creative role. And so he's driving a lot of that kind of strategy and feedback and has a really good eye for it. There's input and feedback from the growth side and the data side of like, yeah, we know that doesn't work, or hey, we got to think about like the potential implications or considerations. This could cause a CX issue if we message it this way, right? So there's a lot of feedback pipeline happening that way, but the kind of like initial strategy and like thinking outside the box comes from our creative director.
Got you. And Darlene, agency person in the room, I'm so curious to hear about your experiences, not only at Tube Science, but your entire career, because it's spanned across so many different areas.
Yeah. So I feel like I'm in a great position here because I speak with about anywhere between 1,000 to 2,000 inbound folks from our website that want to partner up with us and get a really good idea of segmenting like who are the folks that have reached 500K plus levels on a single channel profitably and what are the common denominators of the folks that have not. And oftentimes, one of the most common denominators is the lack of an in-house team that is focused on performance-driven creative, that is working internally, that is incentivized for revenue-driven actions, and where they are working for a leadership team that genuinely prioritizes and understands how to think about performance and brand, right? And so I would say that like having an in-house team is like a non-negotiable aspect. It also does give you the benefit additionally to, I agree with everything Cody and Rose said. And in addition to that, marketing is now like your product roadmap information flywheel, right? So when you're in a very competitive space, where there's oftentimes like tons of disruptors that emerge the second that you establish a market for a product innovation that you've come to the market with, what becomes really important is that you have a feedback loop for what people care about. And oftentimes that's your ads, right? So like, what are the barriers that people care about of entry that are creating situations where the ads are not working and the product doesn't resolve for? Or what are the other types of products that these people care about? And you get a lot of that from your marketing team. So I think that like when you're first getting started off, it is super important to have an in-house team. Second to that, you don't need as much volume when you're not spending as much, right? So I think that's another mistake folks make is over testing and then spreading learnings too thin across the account and not allowing anything to get out of the learning phase or even approach 50 conversion events per week. And so because you don't need too much volume, then it's actually like more economically responsible to have the folks working on this in-house for those two reasons. At some point, when you spend enough, you'll notice that your need for more creative and a consistent success rate on that creative is going to start to grow exponentially, not linearly. So if you're a 500K spender and you did it last month with 200 new ads, if you want to spend $1 million, you're not going to need 400. You might need 600. You might need 1,000, right? And that's because the more that you spend, you're inherently reaching lower and lower consideration audiences. So you have to have more strategy applied and you have to launch more tests to succeed with those lower intent audiences. And at that point, you reach a diminishing point of returns where it does make more sense to have an external pay for performance partner, right? Involved. And it's really nice to say that, as Tube Science, like there's a market for pay for performance. Like that was one of our company missions, was to disrupt the agency model. And so I think that when you reach that point is when it's a good milestone for you to start thinking about bringing in an external partner.
Love it. And something you had ended there and also brought it up earlier in your response, but you talked about like incentivizing teams in the right way. And then in the agency world, pay for performance. So earlier in the conversation, I think you were alluding to like internal brands building out their own creative teams. So talk me through like the wide range of what it means to properly incentivize creative strategy, creative teams, and what that means to you.
Yeah. So was that for me, Evan?
Yeah. Sorry, throwing it back at you, Darlene. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that it's important to align any creative strategist's incentives with the outcomes. Like Charlie, I'm a huge Charlie Munger fan. He said if you tell me the incentives, I'll tell you what the outcomes are ahead of time.
Yep.
And so basing your team's comp on profit for the company is the ideal scenario, right? That allows them to move freely across creating 20 small hits or focusing on creating some whales, right? Because profit is at the end of every single performance review, or maybe their bonus incentive plan. That's certainly how we do things at Tube Science. And because our entire model is aligned to drive profitable spend from our clients, it makes it really nice and easy for us to measure those things for our teams, right? And so I think that that's the first part. I think the second thing that is really important to recognize, where I've seen like really great in-house leadership from creative teams, is to get out of their way, like, and to let them be experimental. The most awesome thing about what we are living right now as marketers is this huge shift from like a brand telling you how you should think and feel and selling you a product to aligning like with a consumer's communication style, what is great about the product and why they should care about it. So it's a very consumer driven era in marketing versus like, what it used to be, I'd say like 10 to 20 years ago. And so, and that allows us as marketers to be really like creative, right? So I think that like, I would call shooting things as the hip, like some of the more experimental things that folks do. But it's important to also like keep folks motivated. So there's incentives that are kind of easy to calculate because you can just tie them to the amount of revenue that's driven profitably. And then there's also like keeping the teams motivated, because performance marketing, it's not a very thankful world, right? Like the second that you do something great, your media buyer is going to spend up on it and then accelerate decay. And before you know it, that you got to get the iteration process in there fighting that decay. And clients that spend $3 million are not going to be like, sounds good, let's do that again next month. I want to spend $5 million. And so I think it's just as important to, as a creative leadership in that position, to find ways not only to incentivize folks, but to keep them motivated. Because it's a fast-paced job, right? So those feedback loops are pretty fast, but then right after it comes more work, right? The second you do well. So you have to find a way to resolve both of those things within your organization if you want a fluid, moving performance creative team.
Very good. Very, very good. Okay, Cody, next question I have is for you. So Rose gave us a little bit of insight into team structures, talking about like creative team internally and creative director. In your world, Cody, what I'm curious about is who is your team that makes the creative engine come to life? And even throw in like the growth side too, on who's running the ads and what that looks like.
Yeah, for sure. Can definitely share. Again, it's going to be so different for every company, just depending on kind of your internal DNA. What's your either founder, CMO, or head of growth skill set? Some people are more data driven. Some creative teams, so some creative, our growth people might be more data driven. Some might have more creative skills than others. And some creative directors and departments might be purely on like the creative brand side. And then some that are more of, pure growth kind of DNA company might be more on the performance side. So I think that depends. For us, our creative team is amazing. They focus more on the brand side. So very, very, very good at kind of making things look on brand, look cohesive, not necessarily driven by performance. And I think that's totally fine. They do a lot of kind of like our in-house shoots. We kind of partner, we, collaborate on them. Fortunately here, they actually like report to me in marketing. So it kind of makes things like easier to, be able to work with. And then we have a, kind of what we're building out, like a growth creative pod. So I currently kind of oversee all signs of growth. Actually, still kind of doing a little bit of the media buying as well, but training some people on that side as well. And then we have a growth creative strategist, right? So she is on the growth team. So she sits on the growth team. We don't necessarily have like strong bonus or incentives, like financial incentives per person, but I think it's important to have people on the team that they're incentivized to obviously grow with and grow. So it's that's essentially our creative strategist is just focused on making ads that convert. How do we come up with ideas? How are we doing research? Talking to customers, talking to our influencer team, all that kind of good stuff. Under them, they have an editor and then a designer as well. So they're kind of responsible. Again, we're trying for creative diversity, so they will work with our creative team for the in-house shoots, the production, collaborate on those. We're doing some TV ads soon, so collaborate on all of those. They will work with the influencer team on, kind of partnership ads, whitelisted ads, things like that. They will work with our growth actually manager. So just to kind of take over some of the load, we'll do some static stuff as well. We'll kind of do a lot of like the concepting and briefing on statics, but they'll just be responsible in overseeing it and obviously coming up with ideas. So it's something that I've seen a lot more of. I think having that creative pod on the growth team is something that it's pretty new for us. It's probably 3 or 4 months old, and it's been a huge weight off everybody's shoulders. Just having a single team dedicated just to making ads, because as Darlene mentioned, I mean it's exponential how many ads you need, and there's are always the debates about quantity versus quality. And again, I think it's one of those and things. It's not either or. You need quantity and quality, but I think it's one of those and things. And we just need so much creative, and we need such diverse creative that you have to have people on your team who is just like their constant mission. It's not like they can do some ads and then some organic social posts. It's like we just need so many ads every single week. So we can't really ever take our eyes off that ball.
And we always discount how hard it is to like achieve the scale with quality, right? Like it's like you need people, similar to what Darlene was saying, like you need people to have the freedom to actually be creative to produce the quality. So it's cool how that kind of compounds. We're going to jump to the Q&A in a second here, but Cody, I do have one follow-up for you. So basically the creative team, just to confirm, has existed for a while. Like when you started out, you were doing all of the growth style roles, but the creative team has existed like since inception. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Grown but existed. Yep.
Grown but existed. Correct. Okay. So what I'm curious about now is like for the audience who might be starting to build out what's going on at Jones Drone Beauty, and they want to try and like draw inspiration of what to do on their side, at their brands. What are the first 3 hires that you would make, for example, to help fuel this engine?
We assuming they already have a growth team and then like a standard creative team, but looking for this like growth
I would
creative
say like
pod.
let's assume that they have standard creative resourcing. So it's just like an editor. You can go get people who can shoot, but you don't have anybody to deploy. So it's like you can't actually scale to new audiences or whatever it might be.
Okay. So I would say creative strategist. I mean, you guys have kind of championed this and pioneered this and, been really vocal about it. But I think it's either a media buyer who understands performance, who has a knack for creative, can analyze data, but also can actually be creative. I think a lot of times people forget about that as, we might know what performance, but you still want to be creative so you can take those bigger swings. Or you can go from the other side and hire somebody or train somebody who has more of a creative pipeline background, but also has a knack for performance and can understand it. I think either of those can work. So I think creative strategist. For us, we found somebody who was a really talented editor and kind of had been, trained into the creative strategist role. So I think that would be, number one. That's probably like the most important thing I would start with. Again, everything is going to be different. Then probably an editor. I think having a video editor underneath them, prefer in-house, because I think communication is crucial. And if you can like operationalize a lot of those learnings, then you just have a better chance of success in the future. But if not, you can totally go freelance or something like that. And then also a designer. Those are like the core few. Obviously, those the designer and the editor won't be really creating or producing net new things. So you have to make sure you're having that pipeline coming in. That might be agencies, that might be freelancers, content creators, might be shooting it in-house with your creative team. It depends, but I think definitely having strategist and then some combination of editor and designer to kind of make all those variations, do those tests is probably where I would start.
Amazing. Perfect. Everybody, you heard it here first. If you're starting to build out the team, you know what to do. I do want to jump over to the audience Q&A at this point. So we've had a ton of questions that are starting to trickle in. Please keep upvoting if something starts to resonate with you. And the one that I wanted to call out first, Darlene, this one's on your end. So Gabriel's asking, Tube Science was pointed out as the company that handles iteration process well. This was by Paige at True Classic for context. What do you do that sets yourself apart from other companies trying the same things?
Thanks, Gabriel, for the question. This is a solid question. So our iterative process is set up in 2 different pipelines. So let's talk about them separately. The first is when we deliver a round of ads to any client, one of 2 things can happen. They either work or they don't work. And work for us means that they're spending close to or past a 10K level at a 15% better CPO or ROAS than the client. That's how our model works. And so if they work, then the iterative cycle is designed to create multiple versions of that ad by changing different elements of it without sacrificing the core of what worked. So every single ad at Tube Science, like I said, is designed with experiments in mind. So we have this advantage in our process where we have already written down very intentionally what it is that we're testing. And so when we have results, we usually have them across a set of advertisers where we're running the same experiments and they're across different kinds of companies. And so we have statistical significance and are able to prove out what worked and not pull that out of our iterations. You can totally, by the way, do this with in-house ads. If you're testing them in batches and you're running experiments, you can run them on different kinds of talent or different kinds of like narrative structures. For example, if you're testing openers and you can validate or invalidate your hypotheses and group them together and feel confident in what worked. So when something wins, the iterative cycle is designed to go to work fighting decay because media buyers are going to crank up budget, they're going to accelerate decay. And so we might do things like change the opening sequence, change the ad copy, but just keep iterating and redelivering those ads to our clients in a pace that we try and get ahead of their spending increases week after week after week. This is if you have a healthy portfolio, 50% of your portfolio should be this, by the way. It should be iterations of things that have already proven to work. They have the highest ROI. They have the highest hit rate. I often find many folks have been kind of like trained to think of like things aren't working. I need to do something new. Whereas like when you look at the data, making micro changes to things that have already proven themselves out to work is actually the highest ROI action you can take. And then the second iterative cycle that we have is if something doesn't work, right? So it is important for everyone out there that's listening to not just do iterations, right? Because if you're just iterating, you're hitting that one persona, your delivery becomes homogenous, and then it's a ticking time bomb for high CPAs, right? You never know when it's going to happen to you. And to address when our clients, when our ads fail to work, we take the test budget that the client spent testing that ad, and then we look at a string of metrics in the creative funnel and try and reverse engineer into where the breakdowns were. And then we apply that information, and then round after round, we're making fixes. So to give you like an example of one data combination, let's say that an ad had like really high thumb stop rate, but really low click rate. This is a super easy one. I think everyone's familiar with that. Like, then we would say like, oh, the breakdown was like in the incentives to get someone to click over, or like the selling sequence, what have you. Maybe we didn't build enough exit points. And then we'll make fixes. And round after round, the expectation is that we get closer and closer to win so that we can graduate that to the winning cohort and fight decay. I hope I answered your question, Gabriel, but if not, come in through the chat and ask a follow-up.
The only thing, Darlene, that I'll ask is just like, there's the creative production and then it's performance. Do you and the team also jump in and like run the media? Is that what's happening here? Or do you advise on how they should like run these testing campaigns? Because there's also a structural element to it too here.
Yeah, so we're either doing one or the other of those two things.
Got you.
I would say like most of our clients just because of the sheer size. So most Tube Science clients are spending $1 million plus by the time we enter into the ring. Have in very like the best media buyers out there, like cool. So, and so most of our clients are buying in-house, but we do have a segment of clients where we're handling the media. Even for the ones where we're not, though, we are sending very regular optimization strategy notes because, of course, we have this benefit of looking across the ecosystem of the largest accounts and seeing different kind of things that are working, right? So like, launching things into ASC, for example, or testing multiple different optimization tactics as you scale your spend. When Reels started to work,
yeah.
Stuff like that, right? Like, and so, of course, we're sending out like regular recommendations to all of our clients as well that are very specific to each ad. And oftentimes you'll find my team reaching out to their clients and being like, "This Tube Science ad decayed. Can you shut it off?" So yeah, we try and cover those bases as well.
Cool. I love it. I love it. Okay, so the next question, I don't know if it's spicy or not, to be honest. So call your call on how much you're willing to share or not here, but it's a comp question. So Rose, I'm gonna throw this one to you first, but specifically with content creators, how are you thinking about compensation? So it doesn't have to be an exact number if you're not comfortable, but it's like performance based. Is it set fee? Is it like rights forever? Anything you're willing to share?
I mean, honestly, it varies so widely that I don't even know if I could share like a specific number, sort of short of walking you guys through like a whole bunch of different things. But I think there's a few different ways that we source content. Like one, we've worked with platforms like Mini Social in the past, and we still work with them occasionally, like when we need to generate a bunch of content very quickly or for certain things. And so, there's like a set cost there, right? Like you're spending a couple $1,000s for like a certain number of assets. They may or may not perform, you may or may not use them, but there's a relatively low end there. And then when it comes to like the content creators, like when we're working with outsource, right, there's obviously the volume of what we're doing internally with like our existing team, so like compensated through headcount. But when we're working with external content creators, it varies really widely. Like, are we working with somebody who is an influencer, a partner, like the one I referenced earlier? She's called Planet in the Kitchen. She's got like a couple 100,000 followers, huge Amazon storefront, has created a lot of content for us, drives revenue to our Amazon business, like significant revenue. She posted a product together and we jumped up to like the number 2 product in that category on Amazon within hours, right? So it's like we compensate her much differently because we know there's revenue tied to her outputs that is immediately traceable. And we work with her like consistently. Like we have, like I said, most of her creatives have been some of our top creatives for a year plus at this point. And she continues to produce for us. So we look at the compensation we're going to give her very differently from somebody who's new or unproven for us. And or somebody, it depends again, are you buying into their following? Are you buying into just the asset production? Are you trying to buy into whitelisting, rights with them? So there's a whole host of factors that go into it. We generally try to err on a little bit more of the conservative side, or even looking at some ways that we can do rev share or affiliate with them if they are a more of an influencer type of person versus just a content creator who doesn't necessarily have their own platform but is just going to make some assets for us. That's usually on the lowest end.
Got you. Okay, that's super insightful, and it's still so cool to call out the person who's absolutely crushing it with everything they produce. Like once you find that person, it's like, all right, let's go to the moon. Sweet. Cody, next one I have is for you, and it's from Jacqueline. So it's along the lines of when you had dove into your team structures a little bit. So Jacqueline's asking, would love to know more about the roles of growth creative team to understand how the workflow could be integrated in teams with more traditional creative and growth teams. So I think what it is like, how do we get everyone speaking about performance at the end of the day? Like that's really what we want to know, knowing that you have a great like brand team. Do they also speak in performance?
Great question. Okay. I think probably then probably makes most sense just to talk about it in terms of the responsibilities that have to happen, or the roles, not meaning the people, but kind of the functions that have to happen regardless. And then I think different people have different people on the team doing parts of it. You need somebody who's going to come up with new ideas, right? So somebody has to constantly be responsible for coming up with new ideas, having new concepts that are going to be produced and launched, and doing the project management of that. That can be the creative team, that can be the growth team, that can be collaboration. But there's definitely got to be net new ideas. There has to be somebody doing research. So the best place to come up with new ideas is not looking at other brands' Facebook ad libraries, but it's talking to your customers, getting on calls with your customers, obviously looking at your past data, looking at all of your social comments and things like that. So somebody's got to do that. For us, we have our creative strategists do that. But that may be the creative team, that may be the director of growth. But I think somebody has to do that, and then somebody also has to be able to share past performance data. So obviously we use Motion for that, but we want to see in a given month or quarter, what are our top 7 spending ads. We'll do comparative analysis. We want to see how much did we spend on video versus static. If we are working with creative partners, you've got to make sure your naming conventions are good. How much did we spend through these partners? How much did we spend through whitelisting versus not? Different styles. How much do we spend on studio versus UGC or something like that? You can kind of zoom out and take a bigger picture look. I think a lot of those data things, actually, we have our growth team do that, even though we have a creative strategist. We have our media buyers and growth team do it because they're closest to the data, and they kind of share on that. So again, it's really going to depend, but you need somebody who's coming up with ideas, analyzing past data, and then also iterating. We have our creative strategist concepting new ideas, briefing creators, video editors, being involved in productions. We have our growth team. So we have a growth manager who's actually doing iterations because they're launching the tests in Meta. They will decide what to scale, what to kill, what to, to iterate on. So it's actually their decision. They will then brief the creative strategist. So they'll be the one briefing the creative strategist, pulling data, often using motion, saying, hey, here was our spend. Here was our ROAS. We use Northbeam. So we kind of look at like our Northbeam one day click ROAS. So yeah, here's our ADA metrics. Here's our recommendation. It might be, this was what we call a yellow ad, right? You're either green, that's like 10% of ads are just going to scale and they're going to crush it out of the gate. Red is like 10% of ads are probably just like not even worth iterating. We'll put that into a creative review deck that we do every 2 weeks. And then 80% of ads probably have some signs of life, but they're just not ready to scale yet. That's where growth teams will compile the data, put it together. We use Notion for like all of our project management for this. And then often we will recommend things. We'll be like, hey, common scenarios, the spent okay, CPA was okay, but not good enough to scale. We think if we got a better hook on this, everything would get better. Here's a report, or here are our top 5 thumbs ups in the account, like have at it. And then the creative team will kind of take that data, take that insight, a creative strategist, and then we'll brief the editor, try to come up with new ideas for that hook or whatever it is component. So we try to just have it be really collaborative and have everyone be clear on what part of that pipeline they're responsible for. I will say when we were a smaller brand, we had one growth manager that played the role of media buyer and creative strategist. So it was a little simpler. And that's what I'd probably recommend for smaller brands is, allow your media buyers to be really hands-off in the account, leverage machine learning, and spend a lot of your time on letting tests run and thinking about how you can make better creative backed by data.
Cody, that's incredible. And everybody, we're coming up on the final 5 minutes here. So I think I just want to do like a quick round the horn here with the final question. So I'll ask it, give you a chance, and I'll just give a general update. So question that I'll ask each of you is just like, we've talked a ton about budgeting, creative strategy in general, times of year, scaling, all this good stuff. What, if anything, is there that you want to leave with the audience as a word of advice relating to creative strategy? As you all noodle on that, Darlene, I'm going to pass it to you first, but just everybody, something we need to do after this is we need to make sure that we're throwing love into the chat. My chat might be broken if I'm on honesty. Sorry, I'm seeing this a little bit different. But throw love into the chat just for the amount of knowledge that has been shared today. It's been absolutely incredible. So without further ado, Darlene, I'm going to throw it at you just on that word of advice.
All right, I'll try and make it quick, but impactful. So don't spend on anything that you haven't taken the time to document for yourself. What am I trying to find out when I run this ad? And the second thing that I will say is that, and this is more of a advice for media buying, but a very common mistake that I see made that ultimately ends up in like non-conclusive testing, is make sure that when you're setting up any new test that you're isolating the creative as the driver of success, so that way, once you've spent your test budget, you understand what those elements were and what those elements weren't. And if you're working on Meta or any of the social platforms, that simply means isolating your concept into its own ad set and making sure that you're spending at a minimum 5, preferably closer to 15 conversion events. Don't knee-jerk turn anything off. Like, you'll run the risk of turning off ads that are effectively going to drive top of funnel. Those take some time to warm up. So I would say that like combining those two things is what the TLDR version of what my advice would be for effectively testing everything you learned in this session.
Talk to him. Thank you, Darlene. Rose, I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Darlene, I'm like mentally taking notes on what you just said too. But I think my advice would be like, don't feel like you have to check boxes. Don't feel like you need to do something just because everybody else is doing it, or because it's something that, worked for you a year ago. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work now, and don't feel like you need to, oh, well, got all this brand creative, I have to use it, right? When you know that might not be what works for you. So yeah, I would say it's really like thinking, like Darlene said, it's like really thinking before you do something. Like, does this actually fit the goal I'm trying to achieve? Whether it's ad creative, where you're driving it, how you're messaging it. I think, we pull a lot of data into also kind of our customer journey from a product standpoint. We think a lot about how our ads contribute to that. Like, is this acquiring somebody on the products we know is going to lead them into the best journey possible. Not just, hey, we got this really great creative, but like it's going to take them somewhere totally outside of that journey they need to have. Yeah.
I love it. Cody, bring us on home.
Oh man, there are so many things that are kind of going through my head, but I think just like bigger picture, I said it earlier, but just don't get caught up in either or. People have really strong opinions, and people have found what has worked for them, and you really don't know until you test. But really think about, and it's not quality or quantity; both are important. It's not static versus video; both have a place in an ad account. And I think you just don't want to get too emotionally hung up or caught up in one style or preference. And you've just got to do what the ad account likes and just give yourself a fair shot at testing things. Have strong opinions loosely held. Be very open to, just pivoting based off what the data is going to tell you. And make sure you're sharing that data and communicating that data so everybody on your team is on the same page for all your future testing.
You heard it here first, y'all. Darlene, Rose, Cody, I am so thankful that you joined us today. Thank you so much. And hopefully everyone was able to learn a ton.
It was a pleasure. Evan, you're a great moderator.
Thank you. I try.
And Cody, before we peace out, Bobby Brown did my makeup once.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, like I won
cool.
it in like some sort of contest when I was like, I think 17 or something, by the way.
What
That's
the
so
heck?
funny. Small
Probably
world.
doesn't remember me.
Small world.
Yeah. Thanks.
Oh my. Everybody, be sure to connect with them on social. If you didn't realize after this, you have to now. Everyone's dropping gems. So we want to be sure that we're tapped in with these folks here. Okay?